So again, welcome to our New Horizons small group. We are finishing up our study in the book of Genesis today and next Sunday. We're using the Explore the Bible curriculum. As I said, we're the last two sessions in the book of Genesis. We've spent 6 months in Genesis. In the summer and fall, we'll be doing 6 months in the book of Acts. This is session number 12. And we're in Genesis 45, and its title is Reconcile. Session number 12, Genesis 45, Reconcile. We live in a world of broken relationships. It's very prevalent when we look at the American family. How many of you know somebody who was divorced? I know several. If you look at the most recent statistics from the American Psychological Association, they estimate that of all first-time marriages, as many as 40 to 50% of them will end in divorce. When you look at divorce rates for those who are in a second or third marriage, it's even higher. It's estimated that every day 1,300 new step families are formed. We live in a world of broken relationships. When we look at the book of Genesis, we see a world of broken relationships. Today we're going to look at the story of Joseph and his brothers, who I guess you could say was the ultimate in a broken relationship. After all, they considered killing him. They, in fact, sold him into slavery and thought they were rid of him. Today, they're going to find out that, surprise, God had other plans. I passed out earlier, Gary passed out for me earlier, some information about Joseph and his time in Egypt. We'll talk a little bit about that today, but that's for you to read on your own time, just for some additional information. Joseph is the last of the patriarchs that we talk about in the book of Genesis. We've talked about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Beginning in Genesis 37, we begin the story of Joseph. And from chapter 37, everything builds until we reach chapter 45, where we are today. And after chapter 45, chapter 46 to chapter 50, everything revolves or comes out of chapter 45. Chapter 45 is kind of the pivotal point in the life of Joseph and his family. So, Genesis chapter 45, let's look at verses 1 to 3. John Dameron, could you read those, and please read loud, because this thing is running again.
King Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence.
So we're kind of picking the story up mid-story. You'll remember last week we left Joseph in the court of Pharaoh. Pharaoh had had two dreams talking about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And nobody could interpret that dream except for Joseph, who interpreted it through God's help. And then he gave the unsolicited advice to Pharaoh to appoint an overseer, a official who would be responsible for storing up the grain during the good years to help Egypt get through the lean years. In chapter 42, we find that the famine had spread throughout pretty much the known world. So even up in Canaan, where Joseph's family lived, there was still a famine. So Jacob sent 10 of his sons, he kept Benjamin home, down to Egypt to purchase grain. And they came into Joseph's presence and bowed down to him. Remember Joseph's dream back in chapter 37 of his brothers bowing to him? Well, they in fact bowed to him. He did not reveal himself, and they did not know who he was. But they bought grain from him. And then, you'll remember the story, Joseph had the money they paid for it put back into the sacks, and they returned home. And he had kept Simeon as his hostage, if you will, while they returned to Canaan. In chapter 43, we find that they have used up that grain, and they now have to go back to Egypt. But they cannot go back to Egypt unless they bring Benjamin, which was the requirement that Joseph put on them when they left the last time. So Judah agrees to stand surety for Benjamin, and Jacob allows Benjamin to go with them back to Egypt, and they go back down again to buy grain from Joseph. In chapter 44, we find that Joseph gives them the grain, returns their money, and then puts this cup in Benjamin's sack as a final test. And as they leave the city, his servants, Joseph's servants, catch up to him, discover the cup in Benjamin's sack, and they all return to Joseph, who says he's going to keep Benjamin as his slave. And Judah begs him to allow him to stay instead of Benjamin, because if Benjamin stayed, his father, Jacob, would die from grief. At that point, we pick up chapter 45, and Joseph can no longer contain himself. He has tested his brothers. Their attitudes have changed. Their concerns for each other, and particularly for Benjamin, the youngest, have proven to be where Joseph would have liked it to be. So we pick up in verse 1, Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all of his attendants. Again, previous chapters, he's lost his composure, but he's done it in private. He has gone into his inner rooms and cried and wailed, but he's done it privately. This time, he's going to reveal himself. But it's not really good for the boss man to be seen by his underlings being extremely emotional. And remember, Joseph is an Israelite. His attendants are all Egyptians who already don't have a good opinion of Israelites. So he sends them all away. Send everyone away from me. No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wanted the reveal to be private, just him and the 12 brothers. Now, just prior to this, they have sat down to a meal. and they have been arranged in order of age, which would have been a little shocking to the brothers, since this was an Egyptian official in their mind, and he knew who was the oldest down to who was the youngest. So they were probably already a little nervous as to what else does this guy know about us. Verse 2, but he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Literally, it means he wailed. When you get to the New Testament, we talk about the mourners at weddings and how they would wail in sympathy. Well, that's kind of what I think happened here. This was uncontrolled weeping because he was about to be reconciled with his brothers. The ones who had sold him into slavery, who had intended originally to kill him, were now going to be reconciled to him. Now, depending on your translation, it will say that Pharaoh's household heard it, or Pharaoh's household was told about it. Not real sure from the original language exactly what is meant. Most commentaries will say that Joseph's house was close to Pharaoh's palace. That would kind of make sense, since Joseph is kind of second in command. Pharaoh would want him close by. But one way or the other, Pharaoh was informed of Joseph's emotional state. Verse 3 says, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? Well, this is the third time he's asked them about his father's well-being. Every trip they have made, and in the first trip, a couple of times, he has asked about whether or not his father was still living. Assuming from Genesis 37:2 that Joseph was about 17 at the time he was sold into slavery, and he became second in command in Egypt at age 30, and we've had the 7 years of plenty, and we're going to find out there's 5 more years of famine to come. When you add all the numbers together, Joseph is probably about 39 at this point, which means he hasn't seen his family, other than the brothers who came to buy grain, in over 2 decades. So he's probably changed a lot in appearance. He's also dressed like a courtier in Pharaoh's household. So the brothers are not going to recognize him. They're already a little suspicious, I would think, because he seated them in age order. And now he comes out and says, I am Joseph. And in mine, it's done with an exclamation point, which would indicate it was an expletive sentence, a very strong sentence. I am Joseph. The brothers were probably in shock and wondered, okay, what's next? They would feel very much right to be afraid. It says they were too terrified to answer him. The word that's used here for terrified is the same word used in the Old Testament to describe the happenings of the day of the Lord. Day of the Lord, if you'll remember, is the end times. So this is absolute, total terror as to what's going to happen to me. We sold him into slavery. Now there he is, second in the land of Egypt. We are here. He can do whatever he wants to us. We may never see our families again. Think about the feelings they would have at this point. So how does Joseph respond? 4-8. Francis, would you read King James, please? 4-8.
And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. How far did you say?
Through 8.
For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall neither be eating nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and the Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt.
Okay. Verse 4 in the Holman says, Then Joseph said to his brothers, Please come near me. Very respectful request. Please come near me. And they came near. I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. If there was any doubt in their mind, Joseph just cleared it all up. I am the one you sold into slavery. Nobody else would have known that except the brothers and Joseph. Joseph demonstrated that he knew who his brothers were and he knew what they had done to him. Verse 5 says, Now don't be worried or angry with yourself for selling me here. Okay, guys, you sold me here, but don't sweat it. It's okay. God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. 3 times, this is the first, 3 times in these verses, Joseph says, you meant it for evil. 3 times he says, but God sent me here. It was all in God's plan. Don't sweat it, guys. I've seen the long term. The last 22 years, I have seen God working in my life, even when I've been a slave, even when I've been a prisoner in the dungeon, even when things have looked absolutely terrible for me. I have seen God's hand move to this point. God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. Now, not only their life and the lives of the Egyptians, but the lives of many, many other people in the area because the famine was that widespread. When Joseph says that God sent me here, the original word in the Hebrew refers to sending somebody on a specific mission. So think of Paul in the Macedonian call. The Macedonian man said to Paul, come over and teach us, and God sent him over with the mission of teaching the cities of Greece. Well, here, Joseph said, God sent me here with a mission. You meant it for evil. God had a plan over and above what you planned, and he sent me here with a mission. For the famine has been in this land 2 years, and there's 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. In other words, there's 5 more years when it's not going to be good. There's 5 more years when will be no agricultural produce. It's all going to be what we have stored up. Verse 7. Second time, God sent me on a mission ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Second time, he points to God as the one who sent him there with the mission of preserving life. not only the lives of the Egyptians, not only the lives of other people, but also the lives of Jacob's family. Because Jacob's family is the family of promise. It's the family through which the Messiah will eventually come. And if you remember back when we talked about Abraham, God told Abraham that your descendants are going to be in Egypt for 400 years as slaves in the future. So this is fulfilling what God has told Abraham a few hundred years before. Verse 8, therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. Third time, God sent me here with a mission. He has made me a father to Pharaoh. Now, not literally a father. The word here means somebody who stands at the head of the ruler. So in other words, the big advisor, the guy who tells Pharaoh this is what you should be doing. He's made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over the land of Egypt. In other words, I went from a slave to number 2 man in the land of Egypt, the biggest kingdom in the region at this time. You meant it for evil, but God had other plans. I went from slave to leadership. 9 through 15. Dean, would you read those, please? 9 through 15.
Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all you who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him.
Okay. Verse 9, Joseph's continuing to talk to the 10 brothers. Return quickly to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. Can you imagine that reunion? Jacob has assumed for 20 plus years that his son Joseph was killed by a wild animal, and his brothers brought back the robe covered in blood. Now he finds out he's alive. Not only is he alive, he's second in command in Egypt. How'd that happen? I wonder which of the brothers had the honor of telling him that. God has made me Lord over all of Egypt. Come down to me without delay. Notice who gets the credit. It's not Joseph. It's not the Pharaoh. It's God. This was God's plan. God's made me Lord over all of Egypt. You can settle in the land of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your sheep, cattle, and all you have. So Goshen, if you look at a map of Egypt, is kind of in the, look at the Nile River, and Goshen is the upper right northeastern corner of the delta area, plentiful grass and all. But not only is it a good place for shepherds, it also is a good place to kind of keep the Israelites separate from the Egyptians. Now, remember, the Egyptians did not think highly of Israelites, And even worse, they did not think highly of shepherds. So Joseph is giving them their own land where they can be away from those who might look down on them, and he's going to keep them safe. There's another Goshen that's mentioned later in the Old Testament that is in the Promised Land. This is a different Goshen. This is Goshen in Egypt, not in the Promised Land. Verse 11 says, "There I will sustain you. I will take care of you." You won't have to worry about food. I'll take care of you. For there are 5 more years of famine. Got through 2, got 5 more to go. If you don't come, otherwise you, your household, and everything you have will become destitute. If you don't come down, everything in the land of Canaan is going to be gone. Your families will die. Your flocks will die. The line of promise is over if you don't come down. Look, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin can say that it is I, Joseph, who are speaking to you. Look at me. It's me, folks. Listen to what I've told you. Can there be any doubt that I am your brother? Tell my father about my glory in Egypt and about all that you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. In other words, go get him, go get your families, go get your flocks, and get down here where I can take care of you. Because otherwise you're all going to die during the famine. Now, tribe of Benjamin, which is what's going to come out of this, it's one of the smaller tribes when we get to later in the Old Testament, but the tribe of Benjamin gets to be very, very important, because the tribe of Benjamin will be the tribe from which Saul, the first king of Israel, will come, and the Apostle Paul identifies himself as from the tribe of Benjamin. So while they are not a big tribe, they are a tribe that figures prominently in the story of Israel. Verses 14 and 15. Then Joseph threw his arm around Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulders. So the two, they are full brothers, fell on each other's shoulders, hugged, and cried over the fact that they were reunited. Notice the brothers. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as he wept, and afterwards his brothers talked with him. There's no indication that the brothers wept over the reunion. They're still probably in shock. Is Joseph really forgiving us? Later in Genesis chapter 50, I think it is, after Jacob has died, the brothers get together and said, Dad's dead. Now Joseph is going to get his revenge. But Joseph says, no, I told you before. This was God's doing, not yours. It's okay. But at this point, they're really kind of leery. Is Joseph really going to be kind to us? Or is this just his way of getting us all together so we can get his revenge? Regardless, chapter 46, they go back to Canaan. They get Jacob. Jacob, again, totally in shock. Joseph, who was dead, is now alive. They pack up and they move to Egypt. They get settled. Everything that Joseph dreamed as a 17-year-old came true. Everything that his brothers dreaded, wanted to end, came true. It was all, though, part of God's plan. He had a mission for Joseph, and that mission was for him to go to Egypt and sustain not only his family, but the world. God has a plan for everything. The problem is we don't always see it. The problem is we don't always understand it. The problem is we always want it our way. it's hard to sometimes just wait and see how things work out and let God do it. Next week, we see what happens again after Dad dies and what's going to happen next before we finish up our study of the book of Genesis. Any questions, statements, anything you want to add to what we talked about today, or anything extra?
It's just a little immaterial, but you wonder what the first master.
Oh,
now
Potiphar?
that- Yeah, now that he's over him,
Yeah,
felt like when that happened.
yeah. More so, what did his wife feel like? The one who lied and put him in prison. God doesn't tell us. I mean, Joseph forgave his brothers. I expect he probably forgave her too. Anybody else? Doug?
It just shows how committed to the Lord, to God, that Joseph, that he really was. He was so committed that through all of that, all of those tribulations, and he stuck to his faith firmly in God. And I think that was shows the glory about it.
Yeah. Okay, let's close with prayer then. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time as we study the life of Joseph. I ask that you help us to be more like Joseph, to be understanding when we are wronged, to forgive those who wrong us, to see your hand in everything that happens. May we look to you as we plan our lives, that what we do will be pleasing to you and pleasing to your kingdom. For we ask it in your name.